What did primitive people eat when there was literally no food? We live in an age of abundance, when store shelves are bursting with food and hunger has become an abstract concept from history textbooks for most people. Food delivery solves the dinner question in half an hour, and refrigerators allow us to store supplies for weeks. But this was not always the case. For 99% of its history, humanity has lived in conditions of constant calorie deficiency. Hunger was not an emergency, but a norm of life, a backdrop against which the dramas and tragedies of entire generations unfolded. It was this eternal struggle for survival that shaped our bodies, our minds, and our societies. Watch the video to the end to find out which product of desperation became a ritual delicacy for some peoples, and why knowing this can be useful even today. When all possible sources of food dried up, humans turned to the earth itself. Geophagy, or eating soil, was not a sign of madness, but a deliberate survival strategy. People ate certain types of clay that made them feel full and dulled the pangs of hunger. This was not just any dirt from underfoot. Ancient people empirically found edible clays rich in minerals such as calcium, iron, and zinc. These substances were critical for bodies weakened by malnutrition. Clay was not eaten in its pure form. It was mixed with a small amount of real food, such as acorn or root flour, to increase the volume of the portion. Sometimes clay was dissolved in water, creating a cloudy suspension that filled the stomach. The process of preparing clay required knowledge. It was dried in the sun to get rid of excess moisture and possible parasites. Then it was carefully ground into powder, removing stones and other impurities. In some cultures, eating earth was ritualistic. It was believed that the earth gave strength and connected people with the spirits of their ancestors. This tradition persisted even in periods of relative prosperity. Archaeological finds confirm the widespread practice of geophagy. Ancient settlements have yielded fossilized remains of human activity containing particles of clay that are not characteristic of the area. This proves that people deliberately sought out and brought edible soil to their dwellings. This practice helped neutralize toxins in other foods. Some types of clay have absorbent properties and could bind toxic substances from semi-edible plants. Thus, clay became a kind of filter for dangerous food. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Have you heard of similar traditions in your culture? The surface of the earth may have been scorched by the sun or covered with snow, but beneath it lay real treasures. The roots and tubers of wild plants were a reliable source of carbohydrates, available almost all year round. Unlike seasonal berries or unpredictable hunting, underground plant reserves were a stable and predictable part of the diet. Harvesting these underground treasures was hard physical labor, which most often fell on the shoulders of women. While men tracked large game, spending days in pursuit, women provided the group with daily, guaranteed calories. This activity was no less important for survival than the most successful hunt. Gathering was a collective activity that strengthened social bonds. Groups of women would go together to areas they knew well, working side by side. During this monotonous work, they exchanged news, taught young girls, and watched over the children playing nearby. The search for edible roots was a science passed down from generation to generation. Women kept a mental map of their territory in their minds, marking the locations of valuable plants. They knew which hillside was best for wild carrots, and which lowland near the river was best for starchy rhizomes. People learned to recognize plants by their leaves, flowers, and stems, knowing what was hidden underground. The shape of the leaf, the shade of the flower, or the time of flowering were clues to the maturity and quality of the underground part. This knowledge was as important as a hunter's ability to read tracks. It was dangerous to make a mistake, because many edible plants had poisonous doppelgangers. The ability to distinguish edible parsnips from deadly hemlock was a vital skill. This knowledge was learned from childhood through constant repetition and practice under the supervision of elders. Primitive but effective tools were used to dig up roots. The main tool was a digging stick, a sturdy branch sharpened with a stone scraper and burned over a fire to make it harder. Sometimes a stone with a hole was attached to such a stick to increase its weight and penetrating power. Flat stones with sharp edges or the shoulder blades of large animals could be used as shovels. These tools made it possible to loosen dense, compacted soil. The work required patience and physical strength, as many roots went deep into the ground and had to be extracted without damage. The harvested crop had to be carried back to the camp. For this purpose, woven baskets made of willow twigs or grass were used, as well as bags made of animal skins. Sometimes women could carry dozens of kilograms of edible roots on a single trip. Not all roots were edible raw. Many of them contained bitter or toxic substances that required special processing. People learned to soak, boil, or bake the roots to make them safe and improve their taste. Soaking was one of the most common methods of detoxification. The roots were chopped up, placed in a woven basket, and left in running stream water for several hours or even days. The water gradually washed away the harmful substances. Baking in the ashes of a fire was another effective method. The high temperature destroyed some toxins and converted hard starch into easily digestible sugars. The roots acquired a sweet taste and soft texture. One of the most valuable roots was burdock, especially from young annual plants. Its long, fleshy taproot contained inulin, which provided the body with slow but steady energy. It was baked in campfire coals, which made it taste similar to sweet potatoes. Wild yams, the ancestor of the modern potato, were a staple food in many regions. Their tubers were rich in starch and could grow to impressive sizes. However, some wild yam species required several days of soaking to remove bitter and poisonous alkaloids. Cattail, which grew on the banks of water bodies, was a real supermarket of the ancient world. Its thick rhizomes, rich in starch, were dug out from the bottom. They were dried and then ground between stones into flour, from which primitive flatbread was baked. This flour was very nutritious and could be stored for a long time, serving as a strategic reserve. In addition, young cattail shoots were eaten in the spring, and in the summer its pollen was also used as flour. Every part of the plant had its use. Roots were stored for the winter. They were carefully cleaned of soil, cut into thin slices, and laid out on flat stones in the sun. In good weather, the drying process took several days. When dried, the roots became light and compact without losing their nutritional value. They were stored in dry caves or in specially dug pits lined with grass and bark. These reserves ensured survival during the hungriest time of the year. But what if even roots were unavailable? People turned to the largest and most accessible source of food, which we today do not even consider as food. In the next chapter, you will learn about the bread of the hungry years, which grew literally everywhere. When the ground froze or dried up and stopped producing food, people looked up at the trees. The forest, which was a source of firewood, shelter, and materials for tools, held the last, most desperate food resource. The bark, which we are accustomed to thinking of as merely an inedible protective shell, became the last hope for salvation. Of course, it was not the rough, dead outer part that was eaten, but the thin, living inner layer. This layer, known as cambium, is the tree's conductive tissue, its life support system. It was here, between the hard wood and the protective bark, that the source of calories was hidden. Nutrient juices, carrying sugars from the leaves to the roots, move through the cambium like arteries. Therefore, this thin, moist and slippery layer is rich in carbohydrates, minerals, and vitamins. It was the real concentrated energy of the tree that humans learned to extract. The most valuable cambium was in early spring, during the period of active sap flow. At this time, the trees were awakening from their winter hibernation, and the concentration of sugars in the inner layer of the bark reached its peak. It was the spring cambium that was the most nutritious and easiest to extract. Knowledge about edible trees was strictly systematized and passed down by word of mouth. The bark of birch, pine, willow, and linden trees was considered the most valuable. Each tree produced a product with its own unique properties and taste. Birch cambium was sweetish in taste and had a relatively delicate texture. It was easier to scrape off, and the birch itself also provided bark, a versatile material for making dishes and kindling. This made it one of the most useful trees for survival. Pine cambium had a pronounced resinous taste and was tougher. However, its main value was its high vitamin C content. During long winters, when there was no access to greenery, it was pine bark that saved entire groups of people from scurvy. The harvesting process was laborious and required both strength and precision. Using sharp stone or bone scrapers, people made vertical cuts on the trunk. Horizontal cuts were not made so as not to block the sap flow and destroy the tree. preserving it as a source of food for the future. Then the upper layer of bark was carefully bent back, exposing the precious inner layer. Thin, slimy strips of cambium were carefully scraped from the inside of the bark. This work required precision, as the edible layer was very thin. The resulting material was rarely eaten raw, although in spring the juicy strips of cambium could serve as a quick snack. Most often, it was further processed to turn it into a long-lasting product. The main method was drying. The collected strips were laid out on flat stones, heated by the sun, or hung on branches near a fire. The moisture evaporated, and the cambium became hard and brittle, like dry wood chips. In this form, it could be stored for many months without spoiling. The dried cambium became the raw material for wood flour. It was placed on a large flat stone and methodically ground with another, smaller stone. It was a long and monotonous process, resulting in a coarse, fibrous powder. This wood flour became the basis for baking meager bread. It was mixed with water until a thick, sticky mass was obtained. Flat cakes were formed from this dough, which were then baked on hot stones or directly in the hot ashes of a fire. Such bread was very hard, dense, and had a specific woody taste. It was no match for bread made from grains, but it provided the necessary calories. In conditions of total starvation, these flatbreads were the difference between life and the next day. Sometimes wood flour was used as a thickener. A small amount was added to liquid soups made from roots or herbs. This made the dish thicker and more filling, creating the feeling of a complete meal. Knowledge of edible trees was critical to the survival of entire tribes. People knew exactly which tree bark could be used and which was poisonous. One mistake in identifying a tree could be fatal. Carbohydrates from roots and bark could sustain life, but without protein, the body quickly weakened. Hunting large game was a stroke of luck that did not happen every day. Therefore, people learned to use any available sources of animal protein. Small rodents, lizards, and frogs became a regular part of the diet. They were caught using simple traps and snares, which did not require much energy. Such prey was small but regular. The larvae and pupae of various insects played a huge role. They were a real concentrate of protein and fat. People destroyed anthills and termite mounds, collecting a nutritious harvest. This food source was especially important for children and pregnant women, who needed increased amounts of protein. The larvae were eaten raw, roasted over charcoal, or dried and ground into flour. This flour was added to porridge and soups, significantly increasing their nutritional value. Shellfish, both freshwater and marine, were another reliable source of food. They were collected in shallow water and did not require any special skills or tools. Snails, mussels, and other shells were simply boiled in water. Obtaining such food was risky, but another survival strategy was even more dangerous. In the next chapter, you will learn how people used what predators left behind. Competition with large predators was deadly for ancient humans. However, they learned not only to avoid them, but also to use them to their advantage. The remains of a tiger's or a pack of wolves' meal could be a lifesaver for a starving group of people. It was a risky strategy. They had to wait until the predators were full and left, but arrived before other scavengers. People drove away hyenas and vultures with fire, noise, and stones. Determining the safety of meat was a matter of life and death. People examined the remains trying to understand the cause of the animal's death. If it was healthy and fell victim to a predator, the meat was considered relatively safe. Even in this case, the meat was subjected to thorough heat treatment. It was boiled for a long time or roasted over a strong fire to destroy any bacteria. Internal organs, which spoiled the fastest, were often discarded. Bones were the most valuable part. They were split open with heavy stones to get to the bone marrow. This was a concentrate of fats and calories that provided a huge amount of energy. Bones that could no longer be broken were boiled in water for a long time. This produced a rich broth that sustained the weakened members of the group. No part of the carcass was wasted. Water was not only a source of drink, but also a rich source of food. Coastal peoples actively used the gifts of the sea and freshwater bodies. Algae, available all year round, were an important part of their diet. People collected edible algae at low tide. They dried it in the sun, which allowed it to be stored for months. Dried algae was added to soups or eaten as a separate dish. Seaweed was rich not only in calories but also in trace elements, especially iodine. This prevented the development of many diseases associated with a deficiency of this element. Thus, the sea provided not only food but also medicine. In addition to seaweed, other aquatic plants were also eaten. The rhizomes of water lilies and reeds were rich in starch. They were dug up from the bottom of shallow water, dried and ground into flour. Water chestnuts, or chilium, produced nutritious fruits similar to nuts. They were collected from the surface of the water, boiled or baked. In some cultures, chilium was as important a food as grain in agricultural societies. Water provided food, but it also hid dangers in the form of poisonous plants. In the next chapter, you will learn how people learned to turn poison into food. In a world of constant hunger, the line between edible and poisonous was very thin. Many plants rich in nutrients contain toxins. Survival depended on the ability to neutralize these poisons. Acorns were one such food. When raw, they contain large amounts of tannins, which make them bitter and harmful to digestion. People developed a complex technology to process them. The collected acorns were soaked in running water for several days. The water gradually washed out the tannins. The acorns were then dried and ground into flour, which became the basis for bread and porridge. The roots of cassava, common in the tropics, contain cyanide, a deadly poison. To make them edible, they were carefully chopped, washed, and heat-treated. This process, refined over centuries, turned a poisonous plant into a staple food for millions of people. Many wild legumes also required special preparation. They were boiled for a long time, changing the water several times. This process removed toxic compounds and made the beans safe to eat. Knowledge of detoxification methods was of the utmost value. It was passed down orally from elders to younger generations and guarded as secrets of tribal survival. A mistake in the recipe could cost an entire family their lives. When there was absolutely nothing left, extreme measures were taken. People learned to extract nutrients even from what seemed completely inedible. Scraps of hides, old leather utensils, and bones became the last source of calories. Skin and tendons were boiled in water for a long time. The result was a jelly-like mass containing collagen. It wasn't the most nutritious food, but it could sustain life for a few more days. Before boiling, the skin was thoroughly cleaned and scraped of hair. Sometimes it was pre-burned over a fire to remove external contaminants. The process was long and required a large amount of fuel. The bones left over after eating the meat were not thrown away. They were crushed into small pieces and also boiled for a long time. This allowed the remaining fat and nutrients to be extracted, creating a weak but still nutritious broth. Sometimes the crushed bones were roasted and then ground into flour. This bone flour was added to soups to make them a little more filling. It was a source of calcium, which is important for a weakened body. Hunger was not only a physical ordeal, but also a profound psychological and spiritual one. To cope with it, people created complex rituals and myths. These beliefs helped them make sense of their suffering and gave them strength to fight on. Many cultures had deities responsible for harvests and hunting. They were offered sacrifices, ritual dances were performed, and hymns were sung. People believed that performing the rituals correctly would provide them with food. Famine was often personified as an evil spirit or monster. Myths told of heroes who defeated this monster and restored abundance to the people. Such stories gave hope and strengthened the will to live. Sharing a meal, even the most meager one, took on a sacred meaning. The distribution of food became an important social ritual that strengthened bonds within the group. Refusing to share the last piece of food was considered a serious offense. The rules for distributing food were strictly regulated. The best pieces went to hunters and warriors, on whom the survival of the group depended, as well as to children and pregnant women. The elderly often voluntarily gave up their share in favor of the young. The most effective way to combat hunger was to prevent it. Over time, people learned not only to find food, but also to preserve it for long periods of time. The development of preservation methods was a real revolution in the history of survival. Drying was the oldest and simplest method. Meat, fish, fruit, and mushrooms were cut into thin slices and hung out in the sun and wind. When dried, food could be stored for months or even years. Smoking was an improved version of drying. Smoke not only removed moisture, but also impregnated the products with substances that slowed down the growth of bacteria. Smoked meat and fish acquired a special taste and could be stored longer. In cold regions, people used natural refrigerators. Meat and fish were frozen by burying them in snow or permafrost. When frozen, the products retained all their nutritional properties. Fermentation was another ingenious discovery. People noticed that some foods did not spoil under the influence of microorganisms, but acquired new properties. This is how the first analogs of sauerkraut, cheese, and fermented milk products appeared. Creating reserves required planning and discipline. Part of the harvest was always set aside for a rainy day. The ability to manage reserves distinguished groups that survived successfully from those that perished during the first harsh winter. The history of humanity is a history of the struggle against hunger. Our ancestors showed incredible ingenuity in adapting to the harshest conditions. They learned to find food in the ground, trees, water, and even in the remains left behind by predators. These extreme survival strategies shaped us into who we are today. They influenced our physiology, our culture, and our social instincts. The memory of hunger lives on in our genes, even if we have never experienced it ourselves. Studying this experience is not just a journey into the dark past. It is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and what people are capable of in the struggle for life. Which of the survival methods described above did you find most striking? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new research about how our ancestors coped with the challenges of the past.